Welcome back, everyone. Today we're doing a deep dive into standardized testing. Specifically, we're looking at how fair and accurate these tests are for college admissions.
Yeah, it's a really important topic, especially with all the debate around the SET and ACT and, you know, do they actually predict how well someone will do in college?
Exactly.
Mhm.
Our deep dive today comes from a 2019 study. It was published in Psychometrica,
Oh yeah, psychometrica.
which is a top journal in the field.
Hmm.
And the authors are Guinness and colleagues. And this study, it uses some pretty powerful statistical techniques to examine what's called measurement invariance and prediction invariance.
So basically, we're trying to go beyond just the scores themselves
Right.
and understand if these tests are actually measuring the same abilities in different groups of students and are they predicting future performance, equally well for everyone.
Yeah, it's like we're getting this X-ray vision into how these tests actually work.
Yeah.
To help break it all down, we've got our expert in educational testing and statistical modeling.
Happy to be here. One thing that people worry about with standardized tests is that they might be under-predicting grades for some groups, like women,
Hmm.
and then over-predicting for others, like certain ethnic minorities. And this study takes a closer look at that problem.
Okay, so how does this study go deeper than past research?
Well, it uses what are called latent variable models.
Okay.
And these models help us understand those underlying factors. The latent variables, the stuff we can't directly observe. But those things influence the scores we see. Like imagine you're trying to measure, let's say, mathematical ability. We can't see that directly.
Right. It's not like you can just look at someone and know how good they are at math.
Exactly. But you can look at things like how they do on math problems or their math grades. Those are like the observed scores. And these latent variable models, they use those scores to try to estimate that underlying mathematical ability, which is that latent variable.
So it's like these models let us see past the numbers and try to figure out what's really going on.
Yes. And in this particular study, they let us assess two really critical things: measurement invariance and prediction invariance.
Okay, let's break those down. So what exactly is measurement invariance?
It's all about making sure that a test is measuring the same thing in the same way for all groups of students. So, like, are we comparing apples to apples when we look at scores from different demographic groups?
Right, because if the test is measuring different things for different groups, then the comparison doesn't really mean anything, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's where prediction invariance comes in. So, prediction invariance is asking, does a test predict future performance? Like first year college GPA, equally well for all those different groups, even if their scores are different.
So even if a test is measuring the same thing for everyone, it might not be predicting outcomes fairly for every group.
That's right. So both measurement invariance and prediction invariance are super important to make sure a test is actually fair and accurate.
So let's get into the details of this study. What kind of data did they use and which groups did they look at?
Well, the study looked at admissions data from the College Board.
So the SAT people.
Right, the SAT folks. And they focused on comparing Black and Hispanic students to white students. And they looked specifically at the SAT math and writing sections.
And what did they find? Was there any evidence of bias?
Their findings were pretty interesting. They found evidence of measurement bias, but in the SAT math subtest. And this was for both Black and Hispanic students compared to white students.
What does that mean, practically speaking?
So it means Black and Hispanic students were scoring lower on the SAT math, even when they had the same level of math ability as their white peers.
So the test was underestimating their true math skills.
Yeah, pretty much. And the amount of this bias was significant. I mean, they found Black students on average scored almost a third of a standard deviation lower than white students who had that same ability level.
Wow, that's a pretty big difference. What about writing? Did they find similar bias there?
That's what's interesting. They didn't. There wasn't any evidence of measurement bias for any of the groups on the SAT writing section.
So it seems like the bias is specific to the math part. This brings up so many questions like what's causing this bias and what does it mean for college admissions decisions?
For sure, and we're going to dig into those questions as we keep going with our deep dive. We have to remember the SAT is supposed to predict how well you'll do that first year of college, like your GPA. And so this bias we're talking about in the math section, it could really be messing with those predictions.
So you're saying colleges might be getting the wrong idea about some students' potential because of this bias.
Yeah, that's definitely possible. It challenges that idea. The one that says the differences in predicted GPAs, it's all about stuff outside the test itself.
So the test could be part of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
That's huge. But how did the researchers even find this bias? I mean,
Mm.
College Board, they don't just hand over all their data, right?
And they had to get clever.
Yeah.
They used the statistical technique called two-stage least squares.
Two-stage what now?
Two-stage least squares, or 2SLS, it's a mouthful, I know, but basically it's super helpful when you don't have all the data you want, like in this situation.
So you can still see how things are related even with limited information.
Exactly. 2SLS lets you do that.
Okay, so back to the SAT.
Mm-hmm.
How did 2SLS help them figure out the bias in the math scores?
Okay, so they used high school GPA as a kind of stand-in for that underlying math ability they were trying to measure, because high school GPA, it's influenced by math skills for sure,
Right.
but it's also influenced by other stuff not directly related to the SAT math test.
So it gives you a bigger picture of all the different abilities and factors that are at play.
That's it, exactly. It's more holistic, and by using GPA this way, the researchers could get a better estimate of the relationship between those SAT math scores and actual math skills, the real deal.
Even with the College Board data being kind of limited.
Yeah, that's the beauty of 2SLS. It cuts through all the noise from measurement errors and gives you a clearer look at how things are really connected.
This is all fascinating. But I'm curious if the SAT is designed to be fair. How does this kind of bias even happen in the math section?
Well, there are a few possibilities. One is what we call item bias. So this means some questions on the test might be putting certain groups at a disadvantage.
Even if those students have the same level of ability.
Exactly. It's not about their skills. It's about the questions themselves.
Could you give an example of what that might look like with the SAT?
Sure. Imagine a math problem that uses like a specific sport as its context. A sport that's way more popular with one group than another. Even if both groups have the same math skills, the kids who don't know that sport, they're going to have a harder time with the problem just because they don't get the context.
So it's like a cultural bias built into the question that has nothing to do with math.
Exactly. And this type of bias, it can be super subtle and hard to spot. You really have to examine every single question carefully to make sure it's not accidentally favoring one group over another.
That sounds like a really tough job to get rid of all that bias.
It is, but it's so important we have to aim for fairness in every single question to make sure everyone has a real chance to show what they know.
So besides item bias, are there other reasons for the bias they found in the SAT math?
Yeah, another possibility is what's called construct bias. This happens when the test itself is measuring different things for different groups, even though it's the same test.
But how is that even possible?
It comes down to that underlying idea the test is supposed to be measuring. In the case of the SAT math section, it's mathematical ability. But for some reason, the test might be tapping into other things for certain groups, things that aren't actually math skills.
Like what kind of things?
Things like test anxiety, how different cultures approach problem solving, even the stereotypes about certain groups and how good they are at math, all that stuff. If these extra factors are affecting scores, then the test isn't really a pure measure of math ability anymore.
So even if the questions are okay, the way different groups understand or approach them could create bias.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. We have to understand the cultural and social context. You can't assume everyone walks into that test with the same experiences and perspective.
That's like you said before, fairness isn't just about the test itself, it's about making sure everyone has an equal shot.
Absolutely. And that's why we need a bunch of different methods to find and fix these biases, not just statistics, but talking to people and really understanding their experiences with the test.
This whole conversation has been really eye-opening. I never realized how much more there is to standardized testing than what you see on the surface.
Yeah, these tests are complicated, and we have to understand their weaknesses if we're going to use them fairly and responsibly.
So let's talk about what all this means for college admissions.
Hmm.
I mean, the SAT is a huge part of that process, and if it's underestimating some students' math abilities, that could really affect their chances.
Absolutely. It could mean talented students are being unfairly shut out just because of their background.
So what can colleges do? Should
Right.
they just stop using the SAT?
That's a tough question. Some have gone test optional so students can choose if they want to send scores or not.
But doesn't that just create new biases? Like, what if colleges start putting too much emphasis on other things, like grades or extracurriculars, which can be influenced by money or privilege?
That's a real concern we have to be careful about, that it's all about finding a balance.
It sounds like there's no easy answer.
There isn't. It takes a holistic approach, looking at everything, not just test scores.
And a willingness to admit there might be bias and then actually try to fix it.
Exactly. Colleges need to be proactive about this.
It all goes back to what we were saying earlier. We need to move past just noticing score differences and really understand why they're there.
Exactly. Are these differences because of real differences in ability, or are we just looking at a flawed measuring tool?
This deep dive has been incredibly insightful. It's clear that standardized tests are useful, but they're not perfect. We have to remember that when we're using them to make decisions that affect people's lives.
I agree, and this research is a wake-up call for all of us to really examine the tools we use to assess people and to push for fairness and accuracy in every single measure.
It's amazing how something like a standardized test, it seems so straightforward, but there's actually so much complexity underneath.
Yeah, for sure. It reminds us that we can't just take any assessment at face value, right? We have to understand, like, what are its strengths, what are its limitations, and could it be biased?
Absolutely. And this research really makes you think about those assumptions we make about standardized tests.
Yeah, we tend to think they're objective, right? Like an impartial way to measure ability. But what this study shows is that there are all these other factors that can affect how someone does, things that are totally outside of their control.
Like their background, how much money their family has,
Yeah.
even what kind of knowledge they've been exposed to. All that can affect scores.
And if we're not aware of that, of those potential biases, then we could be judging people unfairly and getting a totally inaccurate picture of their abilities.
This research has really made me think about those unseen biases.
Okay,
I mean, if it's happening on the SAT.
right?
What about all those other tests out there? The ones used in schools, job applications, even healthcare?
That's the question, isn't it? The implications are huge. I mean, the consequences could be really serious.
Yeah,
We have to apply that same careful analysis, that scrutiny to every assessment out there, no matter what it's for or who's taking it.
we all need to be fighting for fair and accurate measures.
Exactly. And that means asking tough questions, demanding transparency. We can't just accept things as they are. We have to always be looking for ways to improve how we evaluate people.
Well, this has been a really eye-opening deep dive. We've learned a lot about standardized testing, and especially about the importance of measurement invariance and prediction invariance.
Yeah, big words, I know, but those ideas are so crucial if we want tests to be fair and accurate for everyone.
And we've seen how tools like 2SLS, those statistical techniques, can help us uncover biases that we might not even notice otherwise.
So as we wrap up, I just want to encourage everyone listening to keep these concepts in mind. Every time you see a standardized test, remember to question those assumptions, don't just look at the surface, dig deeper, and demand fairness and accuracy every single time.
Thanks for joining us on this journey of discovery. Hopefully this deep dive has sparked some curiosity and give you the tools to think critically about the role of assessment in our world. And with that, we'll see you next time.